They are bigger and more valuable since the financial crisis. With their size comes greater risk. Is it time to break up the big banks? Joining us now on that, in Washington, D.C., Mark Calabria. He's Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. And we welcome back as well Armin Yalnizyan from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and Mike Moffat from the Richard Ivey School of Business with its brand new beautiful building, courtesy of the taxpayers of Canada. And was there any Ivey money that went into that as well?
Yes, it was part federal, part provincial, and the rest came from Ivey.
We're delighted to hear that.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Mark, let me welcome you to the program tonight. Thanks for joining us on the line from Washington, D.C. And I just want to read something. Get comfortable, everybody. This is a little on the longish side, but it came out of the Globe and Mail from a couple of months ago to sort of set up the discussion that we're about to have. Here we go. The sequel to the financial crisis is underway, and there are no prizes for guessing who has been cast in the role of villain. It has been a very bad few weeks for banking. The walk of shame has included employees tarred as rate manipulators, that's Barclays, money launderers, HSBC, rogue traders, JP Morgan Chase, and outright fraudsters, Peregrine Financial Group. The drumbeat of controversy is far more than an image problem for the banking industry. 4 years after the financial crisis began, the pileup of bad behavior is feeding a sense that something remains deeply awry inside banks, despite efforts by governments to reform them. The more benign interpretation is that the latest instances of misconduct are simply the airing of dirty laundry accumulated during the financial crisis. Most of the problems now surfacing, experts note, didn't start in the past year or two. The negative view is that one of the issues that has emerged, the manipulation of a global benchmark interest rate, strikes at the very heart of the capitalist system, even if the behavior in question is several years old. The evidence so far shows that traders falsified their submissions to the survey that generates the London Interbank Offered Rate, or Libor, which is in turn used to price trillions of dollars of financial products, from derivatives to mortgages to credit card loans. They did so not only to make their banks look healthier in the depths of the crisis, but also to goose the trading profits of their friends and colleagues. As one beneficiary wrote in a grateful email, quote, "Dude, I owe you big time. Come on over one day after work, and I'm opening up a bottle of Bollinger." That from the Globe and Mail from a few months ago. Okay, Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one. The Libor scandal, the manipulation of the global benchmark interest rate. This is not a good thing.
No, not at all.
And nobody understands what it means. So I'm going to ask you to give us the sort of Business 101 definition of what that is all about.
Okay, so Libor is basically the rate at which banks lend to each other, so large institutions, or at least in theory that's what it should be. So how it works is Thomson Reuters, so let's suppose you're Thomson Reuters, every day you come out with a report that says, what each bank, how much it costs each bank to lend. How you get that information is you call 18 of the largest banks in the world. So you call me up or BlackBerry me and say, Mike, how much is it, if you wanted to borrow for 3 months in US dollars from another bank, what do you think it would cost you? So you ask me, you ask Armin, you ask 16 of our colleagues, and you do this every day at about 11 a.m., and then you write a report. So what ended up happening here, or the problem was that when you were asking me my opinion, because it was basically an opinion, it wasn't an actual transaction, the banks are accused of two things. The first thing they're accused of is falsifying those figures or giving incorrect estimates, because there was some trader, some market manager who came up to me and said, hey Mike, you've been saying 3.5, but if you said 3.55 or 3.4, we'd make more money, we'd look better, that sort of thing. So there's a big conflict of interest. But there's also a collusion story in here that Armin and I would get together and say, Armin, we really need this rate to go up, but if I do this by myself, this is going to arouse attention. So, I'll raise my figure up a little, you raise your figure up a little, then when we send them to Steve, the average will go up, the Libor will go up. So it's no different than, say, Rona and Home Depot, like Rona calling up Home Depot.
Oh my God, don't use real names, you're going to get a suit here, okay?
Hardware store X and hardware store Y, one calling up the other and saying, hey, could you raise your price of hammers a little? That would help us out. So all agencies, there are many agencies around the world who are looking into this. So we have financial agencies looking into it, but also the Canadian Competition Bureau, because there are competition type stories. So the whole situation is a mess, because the whole system basically worked on the honor system, in an industry which isn't known for having a great deal of honor.
I was just going to follow up with Mark on that. What do you do, Mark, when something depends on people being honorable and they're not?
Well, I mean, lots of things depend on people being honorable. I think you need to make sure you get the incentives right. Ultimately, in the case of Libor, I think we should move to something market-based. We have comparable things like the federal funds rate in the U.S. that is overnight lending among banks. Of course, there are pluses and minuses with surveys. There are pluses and minuses with market rates. But I think you need to go to something where there's less ability for people to basically cheat, and the incentives to cheat are outweighed by the incentives of others to catch that cheating. And so, of course, part of the problem with Barclays and Libor was that there's a lack of internal controls. There was a lack of division between the people who submitted the rates and the derivatives desks, and all of those things should have been caught by the regulators, should have been caught internally at the firms, but were not. But I think overall, you need to separate out instances of where there was outright fraud, outright abuse from problems that got us into the crisis to begin with. My own opinion is we have systemic flaws in our financial system that have less to do with criminal behavior than they have to do with either macroeconomic risk or bad policy risk. And so, again, we should be aggressively prosecuting people who committed fraud. I think one of the problems in the U.S. has been this continual chain of settlements by the SEC and other regulators rather than going to court, where I think, you need to be able to get convictions instead of just having somebody pay a small fine and walk away.
Okay, Mark, though, I think you may have anticipated my next question, though, which is, it sounds to you like this is not a one-off. This is a far-reaching, systemic, endemic thing that's going to require more than just sending a couple of people to jail. Do I have that right?
I guess it would depend on what the what is. Do I think that the crisis was the result of systemic fraud? I don't. But do I think that there was lots of fraud? You could think of the question in this way. Do bubbles encourage fraud, or do fraud encourage bubbles? And I would say there's certainly a little bit of feedback. But I would say when you have an environment in the U.S. and many countries around the world, you had property bubbles, other speculating in the markets, it creates an environment where nobody looks too closely because everybody's making a lot of money. So in some sense, what we should be encouraging is, how do you encourage more due diligence? How do you encourage, more, if you want pessimism, why everybody else is being an optimist, to outweigh that? So my point would be, we absolutely need to be aggressive with the wrongdoing. It undermines, I think, respect for the markets in the sense that the markets are fair. Also, we need to be aggressive about the regulators who repeatedly fell down on the job. Certainly the substantial evidence that the Bank of England and the New York Federal Reserve knew about, if not actually were party to some of the Libor manipulations during the crisis. I think we need to get to the bottom of that and make sure that not only are players in the private markets held accountable, but also that regulators and politicians are held accountable as well. Okay,
let me follow up with Armin on this. And I don't mean this to sound like a naive question, but when you heard about this, were you shocked?
I think it was absolutely shocking. The Libor scandal was called by the business press the crime of the century. That's saying something. We've been through a lot of crime in the financial industry.
Well, that's why I asked the question.
No, this was kind of amazing. That last thing that you had on the screen that showed the clip from the email was just like in your face. Mark's talking about the importance of having market-driven solutions to this problem. Well, sine qua non, the financial industry is driven by making money. And then we're surprised that they're in it for the money and that they're going to do whatever they can to be in it for the money. Mike describes Libor as setting the interest rates for how securities are exchanged and derivatives. There's 150 Libor rates. And they underlie $350 trillion in derivatives. But that isn't just the size of over-the-counter trades. The actual derivative market is $700 trillion globally, all in. And the real economy, the one that you and I operate in, is $70 trillion. So we've got this humongous tail that's wagging the dog. If you don't regulate that sucker, you're going to get beaten right off the track time and time again. That's why we've got more and more instability. So I'm thrilled that somebody from the Cato Institute says we've got systemic problems that need regulatory accountability. Awesome.
What I think we need to distinguish, because I think part of the difference here is I try to address markets and government as they actually are. I don't think we have perfect markets, and I'm certainly convinced we don't have perfect government. I spent 7 years working in the United States Senate, and I can tell you, those are some of the greediest people I've ever met in my life. So certainly the attitude that I think regulators and politicians are public-spirited, but bankers are bad, I don't see a dime of difference between the two of them, quite honestly. And at the end of the day, the question is, how do you align the incentives appropriately? One of the reasons that I prefer market-based solutions is because I believe the incentive structure is much stronger. And to give you an example, if I, as a creditor, have lent your institution millions of dollars, I have very strong incentives to make sure that you're behaving. Now, of course, if the government comes in and tells me, creditor, don't worry, you'll be bailed out, there go away my incentives. Whereas in the regulatory system, we have had a string of regulatory failures without any accountability. I would say, for instance, there is no regulator probably on the face of the planet who failed more than the New York Federal Reserve during the crisis. But what did we do in America? We said, Mr. Geithner, President of New York Fed, how about a promotion? You've done a great job.
Welcome to the Treasury Secretary.
Again, I think you need to have accountability, and there is no accountability on either regulatory or the. I guess I should maybe note a difference. There's accountability if you're small. We had over 400 small banks in the U.S. that go out of business.
But not if you're big.
If you're small, there's accountability.
Armin, you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting in what Mark's saying is that the systemic risk and the skew in the Libor setting was not upwards, which is what most cartels and collusions do. What these dudes were doing were systematically underpricing risk because they were taking way too much risk on. And if people knew how much risk they were taking on, the price of risk would go up. And so we've got this system in which the incentives are to actually lie about how much risk is in place. And when I say there's $350 trillion in traded securities that Libor is setting under, Mark's talking about, the federal regulator. This is the reason why we have Libor, is to settle these trades that are global in nature, so that there isn't one country that is responsible. It's a market clearing device. Libor is a market clearing device. How you regulate that is like putting the banksters in charge of the chicken house.
Let me follow up with Mike on that, because I think people thought 4 years ago, when we went through the greatest economic and financial sector meltdown since the Great Depression, that somehow the regulators were going to be a little more on top of this going forward. It does not appear to be the case. Why not?
Well, a lot of this happened 2006, 2007, 2008 during the crisis. And one of the problems was that people were speaking up about this when the crisis hit. There were emails going to the New York Fed. There were phone conversations, which are actually available in the New York Fed. There's you can read the transcript, and it's really quite funny because the person in the New York Fed's like, oh, okay, that doesn't sound good.
So when you say funny, you don't mean funny.
Funny in a black humor sense. I think part of the problem was that the New York Fed and other agencies were so worried about the crisis itself that a lot of these other things that were coming to light, got kind of pushed to the side. And I think it's going to be important now that when we come out of this crisis, and I do think we will, and I do think the economy is going to get better, that we don't forget about all this, that we make the systemic changes necessary so something like this doesn't happen again.
For example, a systemic change that might address what we've just been talking about.
I would agree that a system where it's just a survey system where people are just giving their opinions about what it would cost to obtain capital probably doesn't work. There's just too much open there for abuse. So I would agree that we do have to go to a market-based system. I do think that there should be more walls. Part of the problem was that, again, the person at Barclays who gave the rates, he had 10 people in his ear saying, could you raise this, could you lower this? I think we have to have those walls in place so these people aren't, we don't have these conflicts of interest.
Armin.
I don't know what you mean by market-based when you say we shouldn't have this kind of system that is market-based, because it was market-based. Libor came in place.
No, we shouldn't have a survey-based. We need a market-based.
It wasn't based on transactions.
It wasn't based on transactions.
Exactly.
So I think there's a difference between having it kind of opinion-based and evidence-based,
exactly.
Both of which are market-driven. But you have to have an evidence-based system, and you need to have regulators. Look, Libor was put into place in London, which was like the clearinghouse of all trades, in 1985. It didn't exist before 1985. We didn't fall off the turnip truck with Libor in place. So right now, Mark Carney, the Bank of Canada governor, who is also head of the, what's it called, the Financial Securities Board, Stability Board, is looking at ways of different countries coming together to do exactly this sort of, what is the evidence base on which we look at these things? I think there's lots of room for fixing it. The fear is that we're going to head back into your first part of your show. Mr. Manley set the right policy climate for business as usual, and business as usual is all about financial investments and making profits, and to hell with any other consideration.
Okay, that's the Libor. Let's move on now and talking about fixing in inverted commas, financial institutions. Sanford Weill, former chairman, Citigroup, said America should separate investment banking from commercial banking. Everything old is new again. Go back to the way things used to be. And of course, he was one of the guys who argued this should be put together. Now, given what's happened, he says better to pull it apart. Do you think, let's go, Mark, to you first on this. Do you think that would solve or at least curb the amount of inappropriate behavior we've been seeing at the big banks over the last 4 years?
Let me first reiterate the point about policy being evidence-based. And so I'm somebody who does start from the premise of if you've provided a government safety net via deposit insurance or too big to fail, whatever that, it's certainly an important role of the government to restrict the moral hazard and risk-taking that that safety net creates. Now, I would say that I think the ultimate objective should be to try to scale back some of that safety net in terms of the expansiveness of deposit insertion and such. But that said, you should therefore look at activities and say, do these activities make it riskier or they make it less risky? And quite frankly, at this point, for me, you could get me to the point where I'm convinced that Glass-Steagall is the way to go, but I just don't think the evidence that I've seen is yet compelling, partly because if you look at the institutions in the U.S., I mean, Bear Stearns, Lehman, these were standalone investment banks. Certainly Fannie and Freddie weren't even banks. You look at the U.S. banks that did get in trouble, who did mix the two, banks like Wachovia or WAMU, they got in trouble because of their commercial lending side. So the fact is, it's hard for me to look at actual examples of where, if we had implemented this, that you would have seen a different worldview. And again, there are other countries where you do have so-called universal banking that did not have some of the same problems that we had. So again, it's not necessarily clear to me. And you can also think of examples. For instance, JP Morgan's a great example of they started to see losses on their commercial side, their commercial bank side from their mortgage portfolio, and then they went over and talked to their investment guys and said, you need to start looking at mortgages and get out of this. And it did inform their investment bank, and so having the two probably saved the whole. So again, it's not clear to me necessarily that separating investment from commercial banking is going to be the solution. I'm actually quite sure that if we had it, it probably wouldn't have made a dime's worth of difference.
Okay, you dropped a phrase there that, again, I'm glad we've got the professor here to help us with a little business 101 here, the Glass-Steagall Act, which if you've been following this, everybody knows what it is, but if you haven't, you're going to tell us what it is.
It's an act that goes back to the Great Depression, which basically creates this wall between commercial banking, the banking sort of you and I do, and investment banking. That was lifted in the 1990s, again, this is a U.S. act, to allow those to come together. And one of the
under Bill Clinton's administration.
Under Clinton's administration, right. Yep. And one of the arguments for allowing this to come together was that it would create additional efficiencies, that these companies would be more efficient. But one of the arguments against it at the time was it would create more these moral hazard type problems.
Which it did.
The con's looking, the con side's looking very prescient at this point.
You wanted to follow up.
So what's fascinating about when Glass-Steagall was taken apart, actually the critical amendments that took place that permitted the Chinese firewall between deposit takers and the gamblers on the investment side, that firewall came down. Why? Because Sandy Weill, the very person you started this story with, actually created the biggest bank, in fact, the biggest corporation in the world, Citigroup. More employees, more assets than any company in the world. It happened at the end of the 1990s. And the reason why Glass-Steagall was brought down was because of Sandy Weill. But when he comes up and he says, you need to create a firewall between the depositors, your money and mine, being the backstop, being the backstop for the people who do take risks. That's their job, is to take risks on the investment side. And sometimes risks go bad. So we should not be the backstop, nor should the taxpayer be the backstop. Let him fail, but he did not say bring back Glass-Steagall. He just said break up the banks, break up their roles. And here, yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, but does that admonition, given that it comes from him, have added weight?
Yeah, like you could hear the sound of jaws dropping all over the business press when he said that. It was are you kidding?
I was shocked. So yes.
Mark, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, a couple points. I mean, one, I think we should start from the observation that this is the third time the United States has bailed out Citibank. And I think as a generality, the economists and market watchers, we all need to be a little more humble to the fact that we don't know what the optimal arrangement for any corporation is ahead of time. You find out by trial and error, and part of that trial and error means that corporate structures that don't work go away because they fail. And so one of the worst parts, I think, of particularly U.S. financial regulatory structure is this unwillingness certainly to let big companies go away. And to me, the solution to Citibank if you're going to break it up, is to break it up in bankruptcy, break it up in receivership. So I want to say that as a general. I also want to say as a legal matter, Glass-Steagall, post-Glass-Steagall, is set up so that the investment banks and the commercial banks are separate capitalized subsidiaries. There actually is a legal firewall. One can debate how many holes are in that those Chinese walls, but they are actually there, and they're set up in a way so the investment banks can fail independently, as could the commercial banks independently. So I think sometimes the press makes it look like you've got this investment commercial bank all under the same roof, and I can tell you that's not actually how it works in practice or in law.
It is in Canada.
That's the broader, well, again, and again, Canada has actually come through this better. So this is, an example where, to me, based on the empirics of it, if you look at the way other countries have come across, if you look at it, the data and the IMF, World Bank have done studies that actually the more activities that banks tend to be involved in, the more stable your banking system. That tends to be an empirical finding. Now, there could be lots of reasons for that. But to go to I think the question you were trying to lead us to, which is forget activities and just look at size, there is, of course, the question of, are banks too big even if they're simply doing one activity like commercial banks? You can take Wells Fargo, for instance. Wells Fargo certainly has an investment side, but it's quite small. They're predominantly a domestic retail lender in the United States. So if you're going to ask the question of, Glass-Steagall would make very little difference to them at the end of the day. The question is their size. And so the question I would pose is, are we better off having $100 billion bank fail versus having 10 $10 billion banks fail? And I'm not sure the answer to that, quite frankly. We need to look at, of course, in the United States, having 400 small banks fail did have a macroeconomic effect. It certainly wasn't something we sneezed off. So again, the empirics of this, the theory of this has to be the risk is going to go somewhere. And I think we do need to be worried about, if we're going to scale banks down to size, where does that risk go?
No, understood. Mark, you mentioned the Canadian banking system, though, and how much better our banks came through all of the past 4 years, and that got our means blood boiling. I could see it from here. What did you want to say about that?
Well, the really interesting thing is, if size matters, Canada's big five are too big to fail. If it's just about size.
But they're also not.
But
they don't practice that risky behavior the American banks did.
No, nonsense. All banks will. They all respond to the same incentives that are out there. Where do you make money? Banks are about making money. They're regulated differently. So we got 5 banks.
Well, they made better decisions too.
You could say that. You could say that
they didn't get into the subprime market in any way like the American banks did.
Okay, so the question is, are we different? Are we different?
More conservative.
Are we different, or are we just at a phase? Because we started zero down 40-year in 2006, thanks to Mr. Harper opening up the floodgates to that, and it got shut right down in 2008.
Exactly. Yeah.
Made a mistake. Yeah. So is it because we are by nature different people, or are we at a phase? Are we just late to the party over and over again? In fact, if you take a look at the annual reports of these big 5 banks, the big 5 banks have $3 trillion in assets. That is twice the size of the Canadian economy. The big 5 banks in the United States, $8 trillion.
Wait, $8 trillion, much huger part of our economy.
60% of the economy. Why are they not too big to fail? Because Julie Dixon and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions runs a really tight rope around every single thing that they do. Everything is checked. The regulatory structure is completely different.
So we don't need to break our banks up.
It does not mean that they're not too big to fail. It does not mean that Canadian taxpayers will never be on the hook. It just means it might be deferred.
Are our banks too big to fail here?
Yes, absolutely.
What do you want to do about that?
Well, our structure is set up so they, at least in theory, that they absolutely can't fail. They're controlled so rigidly. I do find that a little worrying because there is no such thing as an unbreakable system. So I do worry that there should be something in place in case they do fail. And that's not necessarily breaking them up, because again, you could break them up into 50 banks, but the problem is when one bank fails, other banks tend to fail. And we saw that during the Great Depression. So it's too easy of an answer to say, well, let's just make them all small, and then if one goes, it's not a problem. Well, the problem is if 1 goes, and 10 goes, and 20 goes.
But can I be clear here? Are you saying that our big banks, our big 5 right now, ought to be broken up?
No, I don't think that's the answer. I do think on the other, or necessarily the answer. I do think there needs to be something in place, a sort of plan B. If something goes wrong, it would be helpful if we all knew in advance what happened. Because we saw in the U.S. that banks were failing, and then the New York Fed over the weekend was sort of making up policy on the fly. And we'd wake up Monday morning and go, oh, by the way, we've bailed out this bank, and this is what we're doing, and now this, this bank owns this bank. all these decisions were being made on the fly. It would be nice to know in advance, okay, if Bank X fails, what's going to be done.
Okay, let me ask, Mark, I've literally only got a minute left here, but let me put it to you. Canadians love it when we think we have something going well that you guys could learn from in the United States. Are we in that situation here vis-a-vis our banks?
Well, I don't think anybody has a perfect banking system, but I certainly think the United States can learn from Canada, can learn from Europe, and Canada can learn from the United States and Europe. So there's certainly ways that all of us can improve our banking system. I would say at the end of the day, I think the way to do that is to try to inject more market discipline. The way to recapitalize these institutions, in my opinion, is ultimately to turn debt holders into shareholders when these institutions are insolvent, and that way you're disciplining both equity and debt. Liquidation doesn't necessarily always have to be the choice. So absolutely, I think there's a lot we can learn from each other in this regard.
Great. I want to thank all three of you for a really good discussion tonight. Mark Calabria from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being there on the line from the American Capitol. Armin Yalnizyan from the Center for Policy Alternatives. Mike Moffat from the Richard Ivey School of Business at Western University with its brand spanking new building. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.